Okay, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series. I'm Alex Ilsky, and I will be moderating this discussion today. And our topic is the Holocaust's proper place in Israeli memory with Paul Schneider. What is the proper role of the Holocaust in Israeli life? Some say that peace with the Palestinians requires Jewish Israelis to set aside this memory. Is that right, or rather, should they better understand that traumatic experience? Paul Schneider is a lawyer, writer, and member of the board of directors of the American Jewish International Relations Institute, an affiliate of Bnei Brit International. His work has appeared in the Jerusalem Post, Times of Israel, Allgemeiner Journal, and Jewish News Syndicate, among other publications. He has a BA from the University of Rochester, an MA from Rutgers University, and a Juris Doctor from Vanderbilt University. Mr. Schneider will be speaking for 15 minutes, then open up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Schneider. Paul, the stage is yours.
Great. Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. Thanks. So I'd like to talk about binationalism, and I'd also like to talk about the role that Holocaust memory plays in how we think about binationalism. Right at 20 years ago, the historian Tony Judt wrote a short opinion piece for the New York Review of Books. And he said, "The time has come to think the unthinkable." And the unthinkable he was referring to was the end of Israel as a Jewish state. He said Israel is an anachronism. It's left over from the era of 19th century nationalism. The peace process is finished. And he said the best thing to do would be to establish a single integrated binational state of Israelis and Palestinians. He agreed that that would be difficult, but he said it would cause far less disruption to most Jews and Arabs than its religious and nationalist foes will claim. So as you might expect, the article caused a lot of controversy, but eventually his thesis took hold, at least in academic circles. But the various writers who promoted this idea had a problem: how to get around the past 100 years of hostility between the two peoples. How are you going to make a binational state work? Some of them hit on the idea of Holocaust transference. They said the problem is the tendency of Israeli Jews to look at Palestinians as what one of them calls proto-Nazis. So the gist of what they were saying is that if Israeli Jews could get over the Holocaust or somehow manage to put it behind them, they'd be able to live in peace with their Arab neighbors. So I'd like to look at four recent examples of these writers. The first is Avram Berg, the Israeli politician and writer. A while back, he wrote a book called "The Holocaust is Over, We Must Rise from Its Ashes." And the title pretty much says it all. He argued that Jewish Israelis must, as he put it, free the Arabs from the Nazi role we assigned to them. Later in 2019, the political science professor Ian Lustig wrote a book called "Paradigm Lost." And the paradigm he was referring to was the idea of a two-state solution. He said the land between the river and the sea is, as he put it, a one-state reality. And that's what we have to deal with now. That's the new normal. That reality, he said, must become what he called a new paradigm for thought and action, and that Jews would have to accept Arabs as political partners. And here's the important part of what he said. He said, for Jews, this is going to require abandoning shrill warnings of Arab threats to Jewish demographic superiority. And by the way, that's similar to what we hear from Omar Barghouti, the founder of the BDS movement. No need to worry about living under an Arab majority. It'll all work out. Lustig claimed that Jewish Israelis are worried about the demographics of a binational state because, as he put it, the Holocaust as a template for Jewish life contributes to vicious cycles of violence and hatred between Israel and the Palestinians. So again, just stop thinking about the Holocaust, give up any notion of Jewish sovereignty, and everything will be fine. The American writer Peter Beinart has made a similar one-state argument. In Jewish Currents, where he's the editor at large, and also in a New York Times op-ed piece, he wrote, "It's time to abandon the traditional two-state solution and embrace the goal of equal rights for Jews and Palestinians. It's time to imagine a Jewish home that is not a Jewish state." And like the others, Beinart says that Israeli Jews could abandon Zionism and join in a binational state if it weren't for their collective memory of the Holocaust. Later on, he doubled down on this argument in January of 2021 in another essay in Jewish Currents. It was titled, "There is no right to a state." And again, he argued for a one-state solution, but now he added that Jews were never entitled to a state in the first place. That's because, he explained, national self-determination cannot mean the right to your own state. Again, here's the important part. Beinart says, a democratic binational Israel-Palestine would be no more bigoted against Jews than a binational Belgium is bigoted against Walloons, or a binational Canada is bigoted against Quebecers. I would suggest a better comparison closer to home. Take a look at the constant conflicts you have in multi-ethnic states in the region. Take a look at Lebanon, take a look at Iraq, take a look at Syria. That's the real model. A binational Israel-Palestine wouldn't be any different. It would just be constant conflict. You know, the fact is that for 100 years, Palestinians have violently opposed Zionist immigration to any part of the region under any terms. They continue to teach their children that Jews have no right to be there. And even now they make it clear they want Arab domination from the river to the sea. That's just not a recipe for fair and equal treatment of a Jewish minority. Finally, there's philosophy professor Omri Bohm. He gives us the most recent addition to this binational genre. In 2021, he came out with a book called Haifa Republic, A Democratic Future for Israel. He repeats the mantra that a two-state solution is no longer possible. And he argues that true Israeli patriots have to challenge Zionist taboos and must dare to imagine the country's transformation from a Jewish state into a federal binational republic. By the way, the title Haifa Republic comes from his claim that Haifa is a model for what Palestinian and Jewish cohabitation would one day look like. Like Lustig and Beinart, Bohm makes this puzzling assertion that, while Jews have a right to self-determination, the idea that self-determination has to include a sovereign Jewish state is, as he puts it, debatable and probably mistaken. Bohm goes on to argue that Zionism, as Herzl conceived it, called for Jewish self-determination in a binational republic, which did not include Jewish sovereignty. That changed, he says, because of two factors. The first was the publication of the Peel Commission report, which recommended partition, and the second, of course, was the Holocaust. So he tries to get around these two factors and get back to Herzl's original idea of a binational state. So he asks, how can memories of the Holocaust and the Nakba serve not as impediments, but as support to a new binational dream? His answer is, as he puts it, the notion of remembering to forget. The two sides have to develop a willingness to forget all that might pull them apart. And like the other authors, he says, for Jews, this means an end to Holocaust transference, the tendency to think of Palestinians as proto-Nazis. Bohm says that if Israelis can get past the Holocaust, they'll be able to take responsibility for the Nakba, see Palestinians in a more positive light, start to trust them, and learn to live with them in a binational state. Like the other authors, he manages to ignore the fact that 100 years of Arab hostility and anti-Semitism might cause Jews to dislike the idea of Arab rule, which a binational state would certainly include. And Bohm makes no suggestion that Palestinians take responsibility for starting a genocidal war of aggression in 1948. Instead, he puts the burden of reconciliation almost entirely on the Jews, insisting that they own up to what he calls Zionist crimes. He ignores the history of the conflict and basically buys into the Palestinian narrative of Nakba victimhood. Well, here's the irony of the Holocaust transference argument. Here's the biggest problem with what these authors are saying. They argue that it's perfectly safe for Jewish Israelis to put aside their Holocaust memory and as part of a search for peace. And anybody who thinks that might not be a good idea is in the grip of paranoid imaginings. And so these authors claim Jewish Israelis would have nothing to fear from living under an Arab majority in a binational state. And here's the irony of that argument. Holocaust memory does indeed influence relations between Palestinians and Jewish Israelis. It is certainly a factor, but not in the way these authors imagine. The fact is that Nazi-style anti-Semitism has been prevalent among Palestinian leaders, writers, and educators for a long time, and it remains prevalent. And any Jewish Israelis who might be concerned about that are not the victims of delusions or baseless fears. Holocaust may be over, but the kind of anti-Semitism that inspired it continues to live on among Israel's Arab neighbors. The link between Palestinian officials and Nazi ideology began with the Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini. He was the leader of the Palestinian national movement during the Mandate period. He was a man consumed by anti-Semitism. He traveled to Berlin in 1941, where he met with Hitler and formed an alliance with the Nazis. He then became the leading purveyor of Nazi propaganda to the Arab world. This included a radio broadcast in which he urged his listeners to kill the Jews wherever you find them. He asked the Nazis to help eliminate Jews from the Arab world. Hitler offered his support. Then the plan came close to fruition. If it weren't for the Allied victory at El Alamein, the Einsatzkommando commando would have entered Palestine and liquidated the Jews. And they would have done it with the help of the locals. In fact, Husseini was planning a concentration camp to be located near Nablus. After the war, the Arabs welcomed Husseini as a hero. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, called the Mufti a hero who challenged an empire and fought Zionism with the help of Hitler and Germany. Germany and Hitler are gone, but Amin al-Husseini will continue the struggle. Husseini's collaboration with the Nazis has had an ongoing impact on Palestinian politics. In fact, Nazi-style anti-Semitism, including the usual Nazi tropes, has continued among Palestinian officials to this day. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was widely used in Nazi propaganda, is still popular with the Palestinian Authority, and is often cited in its largest daily newspaper, Al Hayat Al Jadida. Articles in that paper repeatedly show PA anti-Semitism. For example, its editor has complained of Shylock-style banks that empty our pockets. Another article says that the PA must protect its people and itself from an enemy which bears its Jewish fangs from the four corners of the earth. And one of its writers accuses Zionists of using Russian Jewish girls with AIDS to spread the disease among Palestinian youth. And in this paper, the PA engages in Holocaust denial. It refers to the forged claims of the Zionists. On its official television station, the PA has issued a call to oppose the Zionist media, which dominates more than half of the media in the world. And these are only a few of the examples. All of this should sound familiar to anyone who's acquainted with Nazi ideology. Contrary to the rosy picture that we get from Beinhart, this is what Israeli Jews could expect from the leadership of a binational state with an Arab majority. So it's understandable they might not want to live in such a state. There's a valid concern here that you just can't wash away by claiming that Jews should just get over the Holocaust. And the situation is not likely to improve. Palestinian students, the future leaders, are being indoctrinated with the same anti-Semitic ideology. A 2017 report by UN Watch shows Palestinian teachers praising Hitler, posting his photo, posting overtly anti-Semitic videos, caricatures, and statements. Third graders are taught that Jews are to be exterminated. Part of this indoctrination takes place in summer camps modeled on the Nazi youth organization. It's understandable that Jewish Israelis might find this troubling. To claim that the pursuit of peace requires Jewish Israelis to set aside Holocaust memory, that's just one more example of its misuse. The point is not to get over the Holocaust, but to understand it. And that understanding should include an acknowledgement of the Nazi legacy of anti-Semitic hatred in Palestine that still exists in Palestine. That legacy, not Holocaust memory, is the real obstacle to peace. And I see that my time is pretty much up. So thank you very much.
All right, Paul, thank you very much. Very, very interesting, very informative. By the way, I just want to add that the very president of the Palestinian Authority made his doctorate about the denial of Holocaust in the Soviet Union. So let's please go to the questions. We have a few very interesting questions. The first question of Ken Miller: Mizrahi Jews were not a part of the Holocaust. They had their own massacres and oppression, and this was instigated by multinational Muslims. As the Mizrahi Jews are such a large percent of the Israel population, doesn't this make the Holocaust model a false starter?
Yes, it does. That's absolutely correct. And that's another big problem with this Holocaust transference argument that these authors have put out. It only applies to the Ashkenazi portion of the Israeli population. It doesn't speak to the history of the Mizrahi Jews, which, as I understand it, make up half the population of Israel. So yeah, that's an excellent point. It's absolutely correct. And it's one more reason to reject this theory.
Thank you. Another question: shouldn't all Jews put the Holocaust behind them and focus on the current threats to Jews the world over, the radical left and radical Islam?
Yeah, certainly, that's true. And that's an important point, because the threats to Jews are now coming from both the left and the right. On the left, certainly in the U.S., you see this on college campuses, where there's tremendous hostility to Zionist thought, and sometimes people trying to impose collective guilt on Jewish students for what people view as the infractions of Israel. So yeah, for sure. But I at the same time, I think it's very important to recognize the persistence of Nazi-style anti-Semitism in the Arab world. And today, the biggest purveyor of this, the biggest promoter of this is Egypt. There's a tremendous amount of Nazi-style propaganda that comes out of Egypt, and it really seems to have a grip on the Arab world, including the Palestinian world, and it really, I think that's what stands in the way of peace between Palestinians and Israeli Jews. And it's interesting that these authors don't do anything to recognize or concentrate on that side of it. They acknowledge that there's this hostility, but it's as if Palestinians have no agency. They have no part in this, and obviously that's certainly incorrect.
Thank you. A question by David. Would you please discuss the different Arab attitudes to the Holocaust, from denial to celebration?
Well, the Holocaust denial is, well, from the beginning, it's taught in the Palestinian Authority schools. Actually, it's taught by these schools are schools sponsored by the UN Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA. They're UN schools, but they use the curriculum of the host country. In this case, in this case, the PA, and certainly Holocaust denial is part of that. Is part of that curriculum. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of
celebration?
Yeah,
from denial to celebration.
Yeah, yeah, that is an inconsistency. On the one hand, there's Holocaust denial, but on the other hand, there's this celebration of the Holocaust, of the attempted extermination, and some writers even say, well, good for Hitler, but he didn't go far enough. Sure, it's two inconsistent arguments, but they're both out there.
Would a split, a question by Larry Watt, would a split state work in Israel? Belgium and Cyprus would argue against it.
I assume you mean by that a binational state. I think not, because, as I said, you really have to look at binational states in the region, and you have to look at the history of hostility. You know, Beinhart talks about English-speaking Canadians, French-speaking Canadians, and you know, they get along, and the French speakers don't have to worry about being persecuted. Well, that population doesn't have the history of conflict and hostility that we see in Palestine and other areas of the Middle East, and the same with I think the same with the same with Belgium. And as I said, I think, you know, the real models to look at are binational Lebanon, how that works out, Syria with Alawites and Sunnis. You can look at Iraq. To me, those are the binational states that really provide a model for what a binational Israel-Palestine would look like. Just an impossible conflict. Yeah.
First of all, I have a few just comments of people who just thank you for excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Long but I think interesting question. Since Holocaust deniers and Jew haters have always demanded that Jews and Israelis get past our trauma, yet never relinquished their own claims of victimhood and ignored their expulsion of Sephardi Jews and genocidal efforts, perhaps they should first get over their claims of Nakba, acknowledge our 3,000 years of expulsion and genocides, and pay for slave programs, stop teaching their kids to hate us. Could we then trust them enough, perhaps start to come back to the table?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all good points. And you know, maybe the biggest part of the problem here is a failure to acknowledge the real history of the conflict. Um, the Palestinian refugee problem was caused because, as I said, they began basically a genocidal war against against the Zionists immediately after the UN partition resolution, and then after the War of Independence, Arab states that had significant Jewish populations that had lived there for hundreds, maybe more of years, kicked the Jews out, took their property, and that's never acknowledged. That's never spoken of. And the number of Mizrahi Jews who were kicked out has been estimated approximately 800,000, roughly the same as the number of Palestinians who fled in the war of 1948. So these are important pieces of history that are never mentioned on the other side, and yeah, definitely there's a need to come to terms with that.
Are you aware of the view that the Palestinian people are an invented people? If so, what are your thoughts? The question of J.R. Pride. I unfortunately sometimes cannot mention the people that ask the questions, because just not everybody writes his name down. So please, those who write the questions, please mention your name.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I've heard of that argument, and I think it stems from the idea that prior to the Israeli War of Independence, the Palestinians were lived under the Ottoman Empire, and they were regarded as residents of southern Syria. They were just an indigenous Arab population living in part of the Ottoman Empire for several hundred years. Palestinian nationalism did rise up, did start approximately around the same time that Zionist nationalism started. It's a fairly Palestinian nationalism is a fairly recent phenomenon, and some Palestinian writers like Barghouti and like Rashid Khalidi go to great pains to say that, no, there is a Palestinian nationalism. The Palestinians are a nation. They are a people. I guess I'm not so sure about that. It's open to debate. I think at this point.
I just want to mention a comment that David added. Mizrahi Jews, the Holocaust reached many of them, as Farhud in Iraq and concentration camps in Algeria. By the way, we just learned recently that the attempts of killing Jews even reached Ethiopia in Africa.
Yeah.
And in Israel, by the way, in Yom HaShoah, in the Holocaust Day, for a few years already, more and more discussion is about the North African communities that Holocaust reached them. So definitely a big part of the North African and Mizrahi Jewish world was reached by the Holocaust and by the Nazis.
Yeah.
Okay, so I see that our time, unfortunately, we have come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Paul, thank you very much I think it was very interesting, very informative, and very important topic. So for our viewers, please join us Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for an update with Ashley Perry. And thank you for all joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
for having me. Thanks very much.
Thank you.